Since time immemorial, plants and fungi have proven to be one of Homo sapiens' greatest resources, not just as sustenance, but as a fount of healing medicine, spiritual inspiration, and mystery. Humans do not merely utilize these species for these purposes, but are intrinsically involved in the cultural knowledge surrounding them, their domestication, and safekeeping. Imagine a world without painkillers, antibiotics, anticoagulants, anti-malarial medicines, or some chemotherapies, all of which have been either directly derived from, synthesized, or inspired by plants and fungi. And who would want to live in a world without the mystery and magic of poison-tipped arrows or hallucinogens? In Plants of the Gods podcast, renowned ethnobotanist Dr. Mark Plotkin, who has worked in and on the Amazon for almost 4 decades studying the relationship between humans and plants, takes his listeners on an inspiring journey from the most remote corners of Amazonia to other exotic locales. Learn about the fascinating history and uses of the plants of knowledge and power, like the hallucinogenic snuffs of the Yanomamo tribe, to coca, from which cocaine is derived, the ayahuasca liana, from which a hallucinogenic brew is produced, or the diverse formulations of curare, a plant mixture which relaxes the muscles of the body and leads to asphyxiation. Not only will you better understand what we know about these sacred species and how we use them, but how they are revolutionizing Western medicine while the fight is on to protect these healing species and the people who know them best. This and more from Plants of the Gods with Dr. Mark Plotkin.
This is the Plants of the Gods podcast. This is Mark Plotkin, Dr. Mark Plotkin of the Amazon Conservation Team. You can find us on the web at www.amazonteam.org. Today, I want to talk about the ethnobotany of warfare. When asked about the use of plants in the War of Independence, Americans typically cite the Boston Tea Party. On the evening of December 16, 1773, several dozen colonists, some dressed as Native Americans, boarded 3 British ships in Boston Harbor and pitched 342 chests of tea into the ocean. The rebels' refusal to endure, quote, taxation without representation helped to set the American Revolution in motion. But there exists a much more contributory ethnobotanical factor leading to the American Revolution, one that appears in relatively few history books. Several hundred years ago, the British Royal Navy represented the most powerful naval force in the world and played a key role in establishing and maintaining the global dominance of the British Empire. Prior to the advent of the airplane and air power in general, the country that patrolled the oceans controlled the world. However, by the 18th century, the British Navy faced a clear and present danger, and not from another fighting force. Great sailing ships required tall masts, and in the age prior to the invention of composite materials, these masts were made from towering trees growing in a primary forest, that is, a forest which had never been cut down, and therefore these trees would have been hundreds, if not thousands of years old. Old English oaks had proven to be excellent choices, but these botanical titans had long disappeared from the English landscape. The British were increasingly reliant on tall trees from the Baltic forests until they found something bigger and something better, 230-foot tall white pines from New England. Now it seemed he who controlled the white pines might control the oceans and hence the world. Therefore, the British chose to claim these trees for the British Crown and sent representatives to the colonies to carve the king's insignia on the giant pines and other species suitable for the Royal Navy. Understanding the value of this botanical treasure, the colonists became the rebels. They would build their own navy and ultimately their own empire. The U.S. Navy's oldest fighting frigate, the USS Constitution, better known as Old Ironsides, and still berthed at Boston Harbor, was constructed in the 1790s with masts of New England white pine. In fact, the great Harvard historian Albion, in his classic book Forests and Sea Power, concluded that inferior masts undercut the effectiveness of the Royal Navy during the American War for Independence. The use and abuse of forests has been deeply entwined with the rise and fall of empires, long before the American hegemony appeared on the scene. Both the Greek and Roman empires were built on and of wood. While modern people generally associate the great buildings of ancient Athens and Rome with marble, most structures were in fact constructed primarily of wood. Even the Parthenon itself, including the famous giant statue of the goddess Athena by Phidias inside the temple, required enormous amounts of weight-bearing timbers. Also carved from wood were Greek and Roman weapons, including spears, shields, bows, arrows, and catapults, and the means of transportation, carts and chariots, as well as merchant vessels and warships. Moreover, Rome at its height harbored a population between 800,000 and 1 million people, and meals for those citizens were cooked over wood fires. This is in addition to all the lumber that was burned to fire their ceramics, to extract precious metals, and to heat the ubiquitous Roman baths. The famous Roman army could no more fight or travel, or even eat without wood than the U.S. military can conduct any of these activities without petroleum. 2,500 years ago, Plato in his Critias complained that within his lifetime, the loss of timber had denuded the hills and plains surrounding Athens and caused massive soil erosion. And today, both Greece and Italy remain largely deforested. The fall of the Roman Empire has been attributed to many factors, from the barbarian invasions to the collapse of social and economic institutions to lead in the drinking water, but it was the wanton destruction of their woodlands that seriously undercut the fighting forces of both empires that once ruled the ancient world. Of course, the martial capabilities of ancient armies were dependent on another range of plant products, medicines. An army that cannot heal its wounded soldiers and send at least some of them back to battle faces serious limitations as an effective fighting force. The Romans were ethnobotanical opportunists, instructing their physicians to query the local tribes about the healing properties of local plants, thereby enriching the imperial pharmacopoeia. Indeed, the most famous natural historian of the ancient world was Pliny the Elder, who served in the imperial military. In one instance, the Roman troops were fighting in what was now the Netherlands, and the men became increasingly incapacitated by scurvy, which is characterized by malaise and lethargy. An allied local tribe, the Frisians, informed Pliny that this disease could be cured by consuming a local dock, known as rumex botanically. It's now known to be relatively high in vitamin C. The Romans recovered and fought on. Notably, the British Royal Navy discovered a remedy for scurvy in the 1700s, at which point their sailors were known as limeys due to their regular consumption of citrus fruits. The history and legends of the ancient Mediterranean brim with tales of plants that harm as well as heal. The ancient Greek word for poison, toxikon, is derived from the ancient Greek word for arrow, toxon. The legendary Hercules was said to have employed arrows with tips poisoned with the blood of the deadly Lernaean hydra. But the hydra was first summoned from its lair when the Greeks shot flaming arrows tipped with plant-derived pitch, which suggests that the ancient Hellenes employed both plant and animal products to enhance the efficiency of their weapons. In another tale fraught with metaphor, the ancient centaur Chiron, half man, half horse, who in myth not only served as Hercules' teacher but taught medicine to humans, was killed by an errant hydra blood-tipped arrow shot by Hercules at other centaurs who were being drunk and disorderly. Chiron also trained other mythological figures important to the ancient Greeks, including Achilles, Asclepius, and Jason of the Argonauts. All of these were botanically immortalized by the plants named after them. Chiron was commemorated in no less than 7 genera. Jason is commemorated in the genus Jassonia from the Asteraceae, the daisy family. Achilles is memorialized in the genus Achillea, which is yarrow, still valued as a medicinal plant and used widely to staunch blood flow from wounds in the ancient classical world. Ironically, an often overlooked figure in ethnobotany was Aristotle. Today, he's most widely celebrated for his philosophical teachings. As the greatest polymath of his time, however, he almost certainly learned medicinal plants from his father, who served as court physician to the king of Macedon. Aristotle undoubtedly conveyed those teachings to his most famous pupil, Alexander the Great. Like any outstanding general, Alexander had to be concerned with the welfare of his troops, particularly any compound that could heal wounded warriors therefore permitting them to fight another day. Legend has it that Alexander captured the island of Socotra, midway between Somalia and Yemen, to guarantee access to healing aloes found on the island. More likely, any ethnomedical interest in Socotra by Alexander or any other warriors was linked to the presence of myrrh and frankincense, medicines of major import in the ancient world. The Iliad represents one of the best accounts of battle injuries in ancient warfare. There are 147 wounds detailed in Homer's epic poems. Medical historian Shimmick has written, quote, "The author of the Iliad describes with remarkable anatomical precision, and not without some delight, a great number of highly varied wounds visited upon the warriors fighting before the walls of Troy. In some ways, these descriptions constitute the oldest surgical report of losses in a military campaign." And another author has written that so detailed are these battle injuries that Homer was not only a blind poet, he was probably a blind healer or even a surgeon. A few words about opium, one of the most important medicinal plants through the course of human history, and undoubtedly long before through the course of human prehistory. Now, the author of the Iliad provided detailed accounts of combat wounds, but less specificity was devoted to covering the actual treatments, although both plants and charms are mentioned. At that stage of human history, one battlefield standard was already opium, which is the narcotic alkaloid containing latex from the opium poppy. And I will cover this in greater detail in a separate episode. Opium, though, represents the most important plant employed for wound treatment from prehistory to the present day, being the source of the prescription analgesic, both codeine and morphine. Opium was used for many purposes in ancient Egypt. It's repeatedly recommended in the Ebers Papyrus, the most important medicinal papyrus from the age of the pharaohs. Two essential uses in ancient Egypt were pain relief and as a soporific, that is, to induce sleep. Both the Greek physician Dioscorides and the Roman naturalist Theophrastus, who I'll also talk about in the episode on wines, recommended opium for these purposes. In fact, Dioscorides was a military physician and an ethnobotanist in Nero's army who was looking for medicinal plants as he marched through much of Europe in search of new conquests. A most famous passage in the Odyssey refers to Nepenthe, the drug that induces forgetfulness. Helen, daughter of Zeus, poured a drug, Nepenthe, into the wine they were drinking, which made them forget all evil. It seems quite likely that this is the first treatment for PTSD. Now, wine is less known as a medicine in the ancient world, but was undoubtedly one of the most important medicines, one of the most important medicinal plants in the ancient world. And I'll talk more about this in an entire episode on wine. But it was first appreciated by people as far back as Neolithic times. There are reliable records, mostly based on research done by Dr. Patrick McGovern of the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, that shows that wine was in use in ancient Georgia as long ago as 7000 BCE. The two of the most important uses for wine in the ancient world was as a beverage and as a medicine. And let me break the beverage down into two categories. One is it was fun because it was a plant of the god. It elevated people to an altered state. But also it was a lot safer to drink wine in the ancient world than it was to drink water. It was also used as a medicine, certainly again as a soporific, that is to put people to sleep. Certainly as an anesthetic, because there were no general anesthetics in the ancient world. And most important of all, and overlooked really in many medical textbooks or accounts of medicine in the ancient world, as an antimicrobial, that is, it killed bacteria. Wine as a medicine is found in the Pharmacopoeia of ancient Sumer, that is the Fertile Crescent. It appears as a medicine in many of the papyri. I mentioned the Ebers Papyrus. It's found in others like the Cahun and the Edward Smith Papyrus. And it is been shown time and again to kill bacteria. Now, most people attributed this to alcohol. Well, you know what? Beer is alcoholic. Mead is alcoholic, but they're not as effective in killing bacteria as wine. And here's why. According to the late Guido Majno, a colleague of mine back in my Boston days, Majno wrote in his fabulous book, The Healing Hand, which is a history of wound healing in the ancient world, quote, "The antiseptic power of wine is no myth, since it cannot depend on alcohol alone. Recent research has pinned down the mechanism to the anthocyanins, a subgroup of the large group of polyphenols present in wine. The most important member of this group of compounds, as regards antibacterial effects, is also the principal pigment of red wines, malvicide. It's a colorless equivalent in white wines, but not as effective. This pigment is already present in grapes, but when combined with a carbohydrate during the alcoholic fermentation process, it splits free and becomes activated. That is, becomes even more effective at killing bacteria. Perhaps the most important and most effective antibiotic of the ancient world is myrrh. Myrrh is the dried resin of several species of small thorny trees of the genus Comifera. There are 7 references to myrrh in the Song of Solomon and in Proverbs, where the harlot's bed is sprinkled with, quote, myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. The most famous reference to myrrh in the Bible is the gift of the Magi in Matthew, quote, "Then they opened their treasure chests and gave Jesus gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh." End of quote. Myrrh has long been regarded as merely an incense. In Monty Python's brilliant satirical film, The Life of Brian, the false Messiah's mother tells the departing wise men, quote, "Thanks a lot for the gold and frankincense, but don't worry too much about the myrrh next time." So valuable was myrrh as a perfume, incense, and medicine that it could be worth its weight in gold. So prized a trade item was it in the ancient world that a primary area of production, the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, was known as Arabia Felix, fortunate Arabia. The first documented ethnobotanical expedition was in fact dispatched in search of myrrh. Queen Hatshepsut, the famous female pharaoh, sent an expedition south to the land of Punt, which we now know as Somalia, in 1495 BCE. The Egyptian bioprospectors returned home with 31 myrrh trees, the roots carefully packaged in and protected by baskets on the voyage home. These were planted at the Temple of Amun at Thebes. Scenes from the expedition, including the boat being loaded with the trees, are depicted on Hatshepsut's tomb at Deir al-Bahri. Certainly the pharaoh Hatshepsut would not spend considerable time and resources to import mere incense. Just over a century after her expedition, Pharaoh Amenophis IV received a letter from his lieutenant then fighting in Palestine. The letter closed as follows, quote, "And let the king, my lord, send troops to his servants, and let the king, my lord, send myrrh for medicine." Myrrh was in fact employed by ancient healers in Egypt, Greece, Rome, and Persia to dress wounds. In fact, it is one of the most commonly described wound dressings in Hippocrates' writings, and Dioscorides mentioned it as well. In the medieval papyri from ancient Egypt, 63 of 66 mentions of myrrh are in fact for external uses. Numerous myrrh plasters are described in the Ebers Papyrus. More recent experiments have shown that myrrh and the closely related fragrant and medicinal gum frankincense from the same genus, Boswellia, are antifungal, antiparasitic, and anti-inflammatory. Additionally, myrrh has analgesic effects, which helps explain why it was offered to Christ during the crucifixion. Quote, "And they tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it," from the book of Mark. Inspired by these ancient accounts of myrrh's healing efficacy, the aforementioned Guido Majno tested the resin in the lab and found it extremely effective at killing the deadly Staph aureus, a typical wound bacterium.
To purchase Dr. Mark Plotkin's new book, The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know, or his first book, Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice, visit your local bookseller or order from Amazon.com.
Popular history gives the impression that Alexander Fleming invented penicillin in 1929. Of course, Fleming did not invent a natural product. Rather, he found and extracted penicillin from the penicillium fungus he found growing on his petri dish at St. Mary's Hospital in London. And the search for antibacterial agents long predates Fleming's discovery. While studying the 1,500-year-old bones of ancient Nubians, anthropologist George Amelagos exposed them to ultraviolet light and was stunned to witness the appearance of fluorescent yellow-green bands, an indication of the presence of the antibiotic tetracycline, an antibiotic that supposedly wasn't discovered until 1948. Further research led him and his colleagues to conclude that the ancient Africans knowingly had made and ingested a beer they prepared from a grain that had been contaminated by streptomycetes, the genus of bacteria that produces numerous antibiotics, and that they used this beer to treat both gum disease and wounds. Furthermore, there's evidence that antibiotic fungi for the treatment of wounds may have been discovered and forgotten on occasions prior to Fleming. The Ebers Papyrus from 1550 BCE recommended, quote, "If the wound rots too much, then bind on it spoiled barley bread." The great Louis Pasteur, originator of the germ theory of disease, observed that some bacteria seem to have the ability to kill others, but he never developed the idea further. And there are persistent stories of British midwives having used moldy bread to treat postpartum infections, but never being taken seriously by the medical establishment prior to Fleming's discovery. Infections have always been part of warfare. However, the advent of mechanized warfare with weapons like the Gatling gun greatly magnified the ability to afflict wounds, and the need for anti-infectives grew accordingly. Beginning in the latter part of the 19th century, combatants in battles from the U.S. war between the states and then World War I died more often of their infections than the actual wounds themselves. Fleming's horrific experience as a field surgeon on the Western Front in France during World War I were undoubtedly a driving inspiration to develop penicillin into a cure for war wounds and other infectious ailments. That antibacterials would play a key factor in winning battles in the age of mechanized warfare was widely realized at the time. Antibiotics are typically associated with living organisms like the penicillium fungus that provides penicillin, or the streptomycetes that have yielded streptomycin and tetracycline. The first commercially available antibiotic, Prontosil, was ironically developed from a synthetic dye by the German chemist Domach. One of the greatest ironies in human history is that the life of Winston Churchill was saved by these German-derived sulfa drugs when he contracted pneumonia in the early years of World War II, before penicillin was widely available. Meanwhile, the communist world was taking a different tack to treating infections. George Eliava, from the Republic of Georgia, was convinced that the most effective way to treat pathogenic bacterial infections was bacteriophages, viruses that devoured bacteria. Eliava, with the support of Joseph Stalin himself, who was of course also a Georgian, built an institute in the capital city of Tbilisi to develop phage therapy. Though Eliava was denounced as, quote, an enemy of the people, and murdered in 1937 in one of Stalin's purges, the institute survived, and phage therapy became a mainstay of Soviet medicine in World War II, with successful phage treatments for dysentery, gangrene, and other battlefield afflictions. Despite some lean years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when Georgia declined to join the Russian Federation, the Eliava Institute continued to research and develop phage therapy. In a world where hundreds of thousands of people die every year from drug-resistant bacterial infections, it's not impossible to believe that phage therapy may one day be used to treat and cure the wounds of war and many other bacterial afflictions that continue to afflict humankind. Paradoxically, the predominant source of drug-resistant bacterial infections in the modern world is the hospital, an institution first devised by the ancient Roman armia. Known to them as the valetudinaria, these hospitals were part and parcel of a Roman encampment, typically built along the frontiers in places like Palestine or Scotland, or along the Danube and the Rhine rivers. Defending a frontier from often hostile tribes meant that there presumably would be a constant supply of wounded soldiers in need of treatment, hence the creation of the houses of healing. These hospitals were not, unlike modern hospitals, airtight and saturated with antibiotics, meaning that they were not a breeding ground for drug-resistant bacteria. Archaeological excavations of a valetudinarium in Novaisium, now Neuss, Germany, along the Rhine, near Dusseldorf, revealed that the ancient hospital made ample use of two plant medicines, henbane, Hyoscyamus niger, presumably employed as a sedative but toxic in large doses, and centaury, much valued as a healer of wounds and named in honor of Chiron the centaur. And I also want to point out that Hyoscyamus, that is henbane, is one of the hexing herbs used by ancient witches of medieval Europe, and we'll be talking about them in another episode. A most important figure in the history of this story is the Swedish-German alchemist and physician Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, better known as Paracelsus. He's most famous to medical historians for the phrase, quote, "the dose makes the poison," meaning that a substance in small doses that might heal in large doses would kill. Henbane is an example of that. As noted, the Romans used it in their hospitals as a sedative, but the ancient Gauls were said to employ it as an arrow poison. Until the invention of the hypodermic needle and syringe, ironically to better and faster inject morphine derived from opium, the original plant of the gods, the arrow and the spear were the most effective means of injecting biological compounds into the mammalian bloodstream on the battlefield and elsewhere. The most famous arrow poison, the curares, are those of South American native peoples. Species of the moonseed family, the Menispermaceae, particularly Chondrodendron, predominate in western Amazonia, while species of the Strychnos family, typically Strychnos guianensis, are more common in the eastern Amazon. These arrow poisons were used both for hunting and for war. In the case of the trio peoples of the northeast Amazon, the only difference between arrows for hunting and arrows for war was that in the latter case, the arrowheads were mounted parallel to the ground, so they could pass between the human ribs. This is covered in greater detail in the episode on curares. Ironically, curare poison, which struck fear in the heart of the Spanish conquistadors, serves as a life-sustaining medicine in the hands of modern chemists and physicians. Curarizing compounds are employed in Western surgery, actually throughout the industrialized world, to relax patients' skeletal-muscular systems, thus reduce the amount of general anesthetic necessary, and is often the case in the history of plants of the gods and other natural products. They started out by using the product extracted from the plant itself, then came up with semi-synthetic and then synthetic versions which were less toxic and more effective. War poisons of the ancient world were a rogues gallery of deadly plants. The Nubians in Upper Egypt dipped their spear tips in belladonna, again one of the healing herbs of the Solanaceae family, while the Scythians of the Crimea employed hemlock on their arrows. The Odyssey mentions Ulysses traveling to the island of Epirus to collect arrow poison. Some believe this was aconite, better known as monkshood, and used in battle by the ancient Chinese and to hunt bears by the Ainu in Japan, the original inhabitants of ancient Japan. Other lethal plant poisons smeared on war arrows were both the black hellebore and the white hellebore. One of these plants was employed by the Athenians and their allies to defeat the city of Kyra through poisoning of the city's water supply. But the deadliest arrow poison of the ancient world was that of the Scythians. These semi-nomadic tribespeople were regarded as the greatest horsemen and the most accurate archers of the day. Though centered in Crimea, they ranged across the Eurasian steppe from the Black Sea to Mongolia, and they were renowned and feared for drinking the blood of their enemies from their adversaries' gilded skulls, and for using their scalps as napkins. The Scythians carried their deadly arrow poisons in quivers made from the arms of their enemies, at the end of which dangled the hands still attached. Many of their tombs have been unearthed during the past 75 years, yielding extraordinary treasures, weapons, and frighteningly lifelike mummies, some of which are women in full battle dress. According to Herodotus, the ancient historian, the first step in preparing the feared Scythian arrow poison was killing poisonous snakes and allowing their bodies to putrefy. Then animal dung was mixed with human blood and buried. Once this vile mixture was sufficiently rotten, it was unearthed and mixed with the viper corpses and viper venom. Even a mild wound from this toxin reportedly could cause tetanus and gangrene. Such a weapon in the hands of accomplished archers could prove decisive on the battlefield and provide a colossal psychological edge as well. Poison arrows loomed large in the ancient world. Paris killed Achilles by shooting one into the Greek's vulnerable heel, while the famed archer Philoctetes wreaked vengeance by killing Paris with a toxic shaft. The great Ulysses himself was slain with a spear tipped with the poisonous spine of a stingray. Such a weapon was considered the stuff of legend until it was found in use by the indigenous peoples of the Brazilian Xingu in the past 50 years. The days of wars being fought primarily with natural products, wooden ships, shields, arrow bows, catapults, curare, snake poisons, and others, are long past. That some of these products, like curare and other poisons, however, may have future potential to aid our species is without question. One example will suffice. Leishmaniasis is a hideous disease caused by protozoans that are transmitted by sandflies. They attack the mucous membranes, causing hideous skin lesions, and can damage the spleen and the liver. They can also infect the cartilage of the nose and cause it to disintegrate. The common treatment is repeated high-dose injections of the heavy metal antimony, which is painful and has dreadful side effects. How the antimony combats the parasite is incompletely understood, and to make matters worse, the parasite is becoming resistant to this treatment. Leishmaniasis is found in many parts of the world, including many parts of the Middle East, including Afghanistan and Iraq. It was so common near Jericho that British soldiers who were infected with it in the early parts of the 20th century were said to have, quote, Jericho buttons. And so many American soldiers were infected in the past decade with this disease that is now known as the Baghdad boil. Leishmaniasis is also common in Amazonia. In the northeast Amazon, the trio peoples treat it safely and seemingly effective with a paste made from 3 plants. How humbling would it be then if soldiers carrying laser-guided weapons were cured of their battlefield ailments by the formulas of tribesmen still hunting with poison-tipped arrows? In conclusion, let me say that the days of plant products serving as weapons and being a major factor in determining the outcome of battles on land and sea are obviously long past. Even in the modern hyper-tech world, however, plants and the knowledge of how to use them can still play a role. Time and again, the modern world has assumed that plants and ethnobotanical knowledge are of little or no use to modern medicine. Nevertheless, in an age where leishmaniasis and drug-resistant bacteria threaten soldiers and lay people throughout the world, plants and plant wisdom and the plants of the gods are dismissed at our peril.
This has been Plants of the Gods, Healing, Culture, and Conservation with Dr. Mark Plotkin. Stay tuned for more stories about shamans, hallucinogens, entheogens, unique religious and cultural histories, and rainforest adventures and cures. If you enjoyed this episode, please recommend us to your friends and rate and review on iTunes. To learn more about the mystery and splendor of the Amazon rainforest, find Dr. Plotkin's latest book, The Amazon: What Everyone Needs to Know, on Amazon.com or your local bookstore.
If you have any questions about today's episode, direct message us on our Twitter or Instagram at Mark Plotkin or Facebook Plants of the Gods Pod, and the questions will be answered by me. Follow our Facebook page for more information, or check the Amazon Conservation Team webpage, www.amazonteam.org, for more information on our field programs. Excited to hear from you. Thanks for tuning in.